¿Funciona? Ok. Como jurista te digo que esta plataforma está un poquito peligrosa. Entonces, pero voy a hablar en inglés porque no hablo muy bien español. Puedo entenderlo porque soy italiano y entonces el idioma es muy próximo. Pero voy a hacer esta ponencia en inglés y después espero que hay preguntas y vamos a hablar. Yes, LabGov is not an organization, it's more like a project itself. It's a project that is based in universities, but to open up the doors of the universities and to make scholars work at the service of the community and city makers, policy makers, civil servants that want to advance the idea of the commons, of collaborative economy and social innovation. So today's presentation is about the co-city and how we reached the provisional conclusion, which is not a conclusion, it's just a new iteration in our, let's say, knowledge process, about how to enable collective action and therefore collaboration, cooperation and commoning in the city. And this all started with I think at this point over-celebrated regulation on the urban commons in Bologna. And the project that led to the regulation on the urban commons in Bologna started from those benches that you see in the picture on which students of Louis LabGov, Sheila Foster and Neil Gorenflo, our founding father was not there in that period, so he couldn't make it for this conference, the first Civic Collaboration Fest in 2014 in Bologna. Otherwise, he would be in the picture because he inspired as much as Sheila and Neil and David Bollier and Silke Hilfrich, the work that we did on the ground to produce this law, which is not really a law, as I will say in a few moments, but it all started also because of these two benches. And why? Why? Because this was the idea of some ladies that were using this park, and there were no benches in this park. These ladies wanted to have their park to be more pleasant and more welcoming, and they wanted to do something for the park. And of course, they knocked on the door of the city government and they didn't find the door, they found a shopping window. They found a window. Behind this window, there was a bureaucrat, there was a civil servant that said, sorry, we are not designed to do this. I'm just exaggerating, but the idea is that you had citizens proposing something to the city to do something themselves and not to ask the city to do something on behalf of them. And the city replied that, at the very beginning, I'm talking about almost 10 years now, like, look, really, our legal tools, our governance design is not thought to enable the action of people. It's designed to command and control, to be a Leviathan state, to impose sanctions, to impose orders, or maybe to provide services, so to do something for you, not with you. We do stuff and you receive what we provide. So these ladies in Bologna were kind of a distortion in the system, it was a distortion, it was as if they were coming from another dimension, so spatially and temporally. And it created some Kafkian, if you want, dynamics, because they went mad. Like, who is going to deal with this? Because it's also, is this a competence of the Department for Parks? Is this a competence of the Department of Participation? Is this a competence of the Department of Public Works? Because it's a bench, and it's every time is something that you have to provide in the public space. Is competence. it was really, and participation was not really participation, because they didn't want to participate. They wanted to act. They wanted to act. They wanted to do stuff. They didn't want to just decide. They wanted to give a solution. They did not want to just have a say in the solution. Of course, they wanted to have a say in the color of the park, of the bench, and the kind. But they also wanted to give the answer rather than discussing, participating, elaborating, co-designing, as you will see in a little while. So. And they called me as a public scholar that was based in Rome, and I kind of gave the first solution that usually legal scholars do. I studied the whole framework, and I told them, look, there is one law, one national law that you could use, and you could create a regulation that is could be able to give you the kind of bureaucratic solution. In a sense, you could give the authorization on the basis of this regulation that would apply this national law that was designed by someone else, I don't know who, but was kind of, by interpreting the law, this could be like, as an analogy, could be used to enable this action. And of course, this is what they did. They used my advice, and they produced the regulation, a first regulation. This is maybe the first time I talk about this regulation. Maybe I didn't. So it was called the Regulation on Micro-Projects for Public Space. Of course, it was designed in a completely bureaucratic way. Everything was made possible in order to prevent, any responsibility, any sharing of responsibility between the city and the city inhabitants that wanted to do some of these micro projects. And the regulation got stuck. Basically, was never applied, almost never. Maybe once or twice applications. So they came back and they say, okay, this is between 2008 and 2009. Okay, what do we do now? Because we are not able to kind of use this tool to really enable the action of what now we call the civic imaginaries, the people in the city that want to do something for the commons. And so I said, the problem is that you asked me as a legal scholar, you didn't ask me as a scholar of the commons. As a scholar of the commons, I would have, told you that you need to have a whole set, of different tools and procedures and processes to co-design this regulation with city inhabitants and understand also what are the commons in the city. What is the entry point for the commons in the city? So if you want to do the commons, then we have to start by designing even the process together. And that's what we started, basically. We created this, and because I coded in some way this process after the regulation, and now we are using this same code to produce new public policies. I will talk about this in a little while. So I won't, just tell you about the process that led to the regulation, but I will tell you about the design principles of the regulation in legal terms, because I think that's the kind of thing that I can add, after the presentation, the inspiring presentation that Michelle gave. In terms of legal, and governance design for the city to become a commons or to enable the action of collectivities in the city around the commons, we started by, identifying in the Constitution, because you would not have, I think, the same principles in the national legislation, so in the layer of the national legislation, in the Constitution, the principles that we could use as a shield, as a form of base, as a form of ground on which to hold on or to build on, the rock to build on the right of the city inhabitants to act for the commons, to have the legal protection and constitutional statutory provision that would defend and ground very firmly the possibility and I wouldn't use the word power, but the possibility of the city inhabitants to act for the commons. And we found these principles in our Constitution in something that I'm coming from a seminar in Madrid with lawyers, with administrative lawyers from Carlo Tessero, and my impression is that you can extract these constitutional principles almost from by any constitution in the world. Because they talk about the people, and constitutions are basically the social contract, are the legal contract that the society at some point decide to enter into. All the different parts of society decide to enter into to give birth to a new legal system. And that's what the Constitution is basically, no? At the national level. So we use these legal principles, civic collaboration and horizontal subsidiarity, to draft what? To draft not just a regulation, to draft an urban constitution. The regulation is more and more I wouldn't call it a manifesto, but more an urban constitution. A pact whereby all the forces in the city are now collaborating, commoning, cooperating for the general interest. We use the Ostrom design principles as a guidance, but just as a first attempt, because Ostrom was working around a different kind of commons, the natural resource commons, the one commons that only, foresee congestion and distraction if you have a sort of overconsumption of the open access resource. Instead, what we did was trying to to adapt these design principles to the urban commons. And you can find that many of the things that Michel talked about, sustainability, both in environmental terms and economic terms, the idea that you need to build on trust and reciprocity, the idea that you need to foster as much as possible the collective action and to give the leadership of these processes to city inhabitants, the idea that you need to ground this on mutual monitoring and social sanctions rather than forms of public sanctions, it's in there. It's in the article and the definition, even the definition, we in some way updated the definition because we said, the definition of urban commons is a threefold definition as it is the governance of the, defined by the scholars of the governance of the commons. And it's, of course, the resource that you share, which can be material or immaterial. It's the community, it's the collectivities, it's the people that want to take action and take legal responsibility, I would say constitutional responsibility to take care of the commons, manage the commons, regenerate the commons. To do what? And that's kind of the third element, which is, I think, that kind of an innovation that we introduce to basically create, yes, a cooperative form of management of these resources, of course, and that was also Ostrom's point, but also we kind of completed the framework by saying you need to have different forms of cooperation. You can have sharing, you can have collaboration, and you can have coordination and polycentricity as a way to cooperate within the city. I'll explain this in a little while, but this is for now the kind of design principles that we worked around because we thought that this was kind of the importance. And then we said, because this is a constitution, and as a constitution is a form of alliance between entities, forces that hold sovereignty, because that's what basically is, a treaty, a constitution. They are legal tools in which entities that bear sovereignty, the possibility, the power to self-determine themselves, which is basically what the commons are, come together and find solutions. So we need to call them not just contracts or administrative acts, we need to call them pacts of collaboration. They are pacts. They are not just partnerships. They are forms of alliances, forms of covenants in which these sovereignty holders, these sovereignty powers holders decide to co-manage these sovereignties. So it's the idea that the sovereignty over a certain territory and over a population is not managed anymore by just one entity, one subject, the state, it's co-governed, it's co-held by these two entities, the government and the commons. Stop me if something is too legal and too technical. But this idea was also that we move away from just forms of pacts, forms of, let's say, contracts, to the idea that we create and we build real institutions. So it's not just in paper, but it's legal subjects that sometimes we create foundations, we create cooperatives, so we create legal subjects, okay? So by creating these new institutions in the city, we kind of create a distributed network of government. So we give not only language, constitutional language, factitious language in the paper, the regulation, but we also make it alive. We create a sort of 3D, version of the Constitution. And now all sorts of community hubs, community co-ops, trusts, community land trusts, and legal subjects are spreading in these cities, in the city and especially in Bologna, in which this idea of the commons and the city and the government coming together is making, is actually a reality. Of course, as you see, this was premised upon the idea that the state, the city government, does not command and control, that the city government starts co-govern. And this implies that you change the approach of policymakers and civil servants. You don't have to have politicians anymore. You have city makers, policy city makers. You don't have bureaucrats. You kind of invest on new forms also of competencies within the city government by transforming city bureaucrats, civil servants, into service designers, people that are able to make people work together rather than, knowing just laws and economics and then, creating new forms of deliberations or regulations. But they work together they co-design stuff, they start projects in the city, and they give solutions day by day together without having, let's say, if you want to use an analogy, without the shopping window that you usually have when you go to an office in the city government. I think in Tenerife is the same, no? You go and you have an office in which the normal city, unless you are a very influential city inhabitant, usually you don't get right away to the table, to the round table. You get first to the shopping window, right? And behind the shopping window, behind this layer of separation, you have the city government. So the idea is to take out the shopping window and have co-design tables and have co-design labs, actually not even tables, just a circle of chairs, and you'll see, where policymakers and civil servants that want to be this kind of, public sector apparatus work together with city inhabitants. And that's the ex ante. The ex post is the lessons that we learned after the regulation, after the implementation of the regulation that was passed in 2014, and then after 2 years of work, we kind of got away with five points, basically, 5 tenets on things that we need to work on to keep developing this model of city government and of public policies in the city. So first of all is that, as I was saying at the beginning, is that we need to kind of really say what it means to cooperate in terms of governance. So it's not just enough to say that governance should be cooperative, that cooperation in the city can be the way to go to govern common resources and the city as a common resource. So we started seeing a pattern. We started seeing that in the city you have different kind of commons, and actually you have different streams of thoughts around the commons in the city, which is something that doesn't happen in the studies of Elinor Ostrom and their associates. So the idea that you don't just have natural resource commons in the city, no? Because you have constructed commons, you have social commons, you have political commons, which means that you need to deal with power, you need to deal with culture, you need to deal with social construction. You have what they call, what Carol Rose used to call, she was a legal scholar that spoke about the open commons. And now today, Yochai Benkler is kind of following this idea, and he talks about this idea that you need to basically create in some form congestion in the city, which is exactly the enemy of the Ostrom commons. The commons that are congestible, if you create congestion, overuse, overconsumption, they die because they are natural resources. Social resources, instead, they need agglomeration, they need construction, they need people to come together. Carol Rose used to say, the more, the merrier, which is exactly the opposite if you think about the Ostrom commons. The more, the worse. And that's why you need forms of shared, governance. So sharing is one thing, collaboration, agglomeration is another thing. And I won't go, even to polycentric governance of the commons, which is kind of the thing where I started from, when I wrote this piece 10 years ago on infrastructure as commons, on urban roads as commons, on networks as commons. But today, the idea is that you need to have a polycentric governance of these networks, think about telecom, think about energy distribution networks, think about transportation networks. And you need to have regulations that enable polycentric action of people within the city that coordinate themselves without even knowing that they are commoning, that they are cooperating. You need to design regulatory devices that, don't go in communities and work on sharing and collaboration, that they are designed in order to enable a collective behavior, a behavioral pattern that is kind of designed to foster collective action of the commons. It's coordination without, let's say, coordination without, in a world of imperfect knowledge, the good scholars say. The other point was that some people in the city, and this is linked also to the idea of polycentricity, that said, but I don't want to always enter into a pact of collaboration. I don't want to always be part of an institution, because sometimes I just want to behave, and I want to take care of the commons without entering into formal relationships, or without being subject to a formal and legal written regulatory framework. So one thing that we learned is that we need to work much more on social norms, on how to revive, because most of the time they were there, most of the time they are still there, how to make social norms, social behaviors that are commons-oriented, a form of governance of the urban commons and the city as a commons. Just to make an example, we have in our rural communities in Italy, and also there is also in Spain and in Germany, this idea of civic uses of, pieces of mountains, woods, the kind of Ostrom commons that you would think of. And civic uses are a form of legal, structure which is informal. It's not really written always in a document. It's not always, it doesn't always bring with it a formal institution, but it's a way to co-govern these resources without this kind of formalities, of legal formalities. And this is something that is happening also in the city. And we need to make, basically, we need to start thinking on how to allow civic use of the city, decentralized use of the city, without always having the bureaucrats or the civil servant or the activists or the co-designers coming in and design institutions or solutions. So to make the city really open, you need to work on this idea of civic uses, and this is something on which we are going to work in different cities, and I'm working on a law, on a specific law, as I will show you in a little while, with the Tuscany region, on how to enable these civic uses in the city. So the third lesson that we learn is that you don't need to scale up, you need to scale down. You need to go basically to make government and governance as closer as possible to the city inhabitants, and to make it as close as possible to the real problems. At some point it has to be a sort of street level, neighborhood level governance device in some cases. In most of the cases it has to be a street level, so you need street level bureaucrats, you need neighborhood level governance devices that can enable collective action, because that's where people live, that's where people can make a real impact, and then once you have all these nodes, you create a polycentric network in which these governance entities or institutions or norms come together and make the city as a commons. So we are working at the neighborhood and street level now. Experimentalism. This is something that we all need to understand, and we learn by doing it, is that commons is about experimentalism. In a world of uncertainty and instability, and commons is the perfect tool, and that's kind of what Elinor Ostrom and all those that have dealt with commons in action have learned by working with communities. It's not as the market, it's not as perfect, as simple as the market or the state, and it's diverse. Every time has to be designed in a way that is appropriate to local condition, which is something that is completely, different from the usual governance devices. Diversity, heterogeneity, heterogeneous ways to govern these entities is a premise, is a principle that you can never, leave out of the picture. It's part of the design of any process, and experimentalism means also that not only you need to adapt, not only you need to kind of make it diverse and make it different every time, but you need to iterate it. So you need to have iteration, as Michel would teach me in the open source world and the free production of culture. You have iterations. You need to have protocols, and you need to improve these protocols and these governance devices time over time to refine it, to make them as closer as possible to perfection. You will never reach perfection, and we need to understand that even the state or the market are not perfect as they are designed to be, at least on paper, no? Because they say, in a world of perfect information, and that when there is no transaction cost, then the market works. But that's kind of the problem, because there is always information asymmetries, there is always imperfect knowledge, and there are transaction costs. So the market itself is designed to be imperfect. And we need to not to sell the commons, but to say that the commons is a process, is a way of doing things in experimentalist way, and that mistakes and errors can be made, failures are there, as there are market failures and state failures, and this is kind of the approach that makes this also a way to convince also the skeptical people about the commons, rather than, you convince them to come along because, and that's what I realized, once you say that, it's imperfect and it's uncertain. Of course, you need to know something, and you need to know, you need to give some certainties, but beyond that, you need to convince people to work with you on experimental projects. And then the last thing that we learned through the implementation is that we really need to stress the fact that the commons should be designed for, not for some, but for all. There is a huge problem with the commons, guys. I have to tell you that there is, and this is even something that Ostrom never dealt with, because these communities were very homogeneous, which is inclusion. Commons are not always inclusionary by themselves. So you need to really be careful on how to, and we need to test through experimentation, how commons can be a way to advance social justice, inclusion, to fight inequalities. Because if you think about it, and it's true every time I go, if you think about it and you look around the room, there is no diversity. There is not much diversity in this room. And most of the times, it's true also in other cities or places where I've been talking about the commons. So we need to make an effort on tackle upfront problems like inclusion of refugees in Europe, or racial problems in the United States, for instance, and all, or understand how this can be a way to basically work with on access to housing, on the so-called right to the city problems, access to basic facilities, because most of the time these commons-based projects do not include, and I'm curious to know if this is true too in Tenerife. I hope that I get some useful insights. But this is something that we need to be honest about it. So we need to make it as much as possible an inclusionary tool. And of course, the idea is that we include as many actors as possible in a city. So it does not have to be just the public and the commons. As Michel was saying, most of these trends, global trends in economy, they extract, this was your point, no? They extract wealth from local communities and they bring it somewhere else. So you do have some interest and some possibilities to convince the private local sector to come along and be part of this discourse. The private sector at the local level should be part of this idea of the city as a commons, as much as the, once commons-based organization, which are the civil society organizations. If you look at them, each and every one of them, they all started as a commons-based organization. Think about, Greenpeace, or in Italy, all the third sector. They all started from commons-based projects, and then they built social institutions. So you kind of need these 5 actors, I usually say, of the commons, of the co-governance of the city. The public, the commons, the knowledge institutions that need to support the process and provide the knowledge that they have not just to the private sector, but also to the commons, the civil society organizations, and the private sector. Because that's how you restart a path toward prosperity by grounding commons in a certain area and by developing a local development plan that is commons based. That's how you convince, and you can at some point really create how did you call it, the cosmo-local? The cosmo-local. That's how you can create. The way to get there could be this one, to create governance, the quintuple helix governance process, and the quintuple helix governance devices that bring all these 5 actors together to leverage each and every of these entities and create the city as a commons. So basically, we are now in that stage, and this was, these are pictures from, this is an infograph from the idea of the quintuple helix governance, which you'll find on the LabGov website. and which is kind of, we started by saying, let's try to understand how the public, the commons, and the private can come together. We went through the idea of the urban commons and the pacts of collaboration, and that's where now we are, trying to understand how we can really scale, or not just scale up, but really go from the urban commons to the city as a commons. And those are the infograph, and this is the infograph for the different, so how, that's the last, and I will I don't know how much time I have left. I'll wrap it up here, but this is crucial because that's where really how you get there. In practical terms, I will be very simple. I'll try to be, I oversimplify, but I'm always available for questions during the Q&A and, on a one-to-one basis. But we kind of tried to code the process that we used to design the regulation and to understand how this code could be a way to design the city as a commons and redesign other public policies, as I say, to also contaminate other public policies and tackle the issues that I was telling you about, one for all social justice. So it always started by cheap talking, by creating a conversation, seminars, workshops in the university, experts, activists, practitioners, city government officials, to kind of understand what cheap talking was a tool that Elinor Ostrom used to use, and to kind of understand what's the entry point, really, for the commons in a city, to understand what is already there also, because you might have the commons and you don't know yet. Because most of the time there is some language that is used in the city that kind of resembles the language of the commons, and it might be the commons. It might be that it's using different words, but it's really the commons. As well as you can have the language of the commons there, and maybe it's not the commons. It's at least not what we all think the commons are. Because some people tend to use now also the commons also as a way to advance political careers, personal careers, and they don't stick really to the kind of values that Michelle talked to you about. I kind of try to frame, and in a more technical way, but they just act in an opportunistic way to use the commons. So you kind of need to create a sort of self-consciousness in the city, in the territory, in the place where you want to create the governance of the commons. And it always starts, of course, by establishing a research unit within the university. We call it LabGov. Now maybe it's more clear what LabGov is, but it's really a platform in which you have scholars, practitioners, city governments, and scholars from different universities, and also the public intellectuals, the cultural centers, the knowledge institutions, which are not just the universities. They might be schools, they might be cultural collectives. And that's how you start basically discussing what the hypothesis is. And then, once you do this, you start, and once you agree upon certain kind of research questions and certain hypotheses on what the urban commons or what the commons are in the city, maybe then you start a mapping exercise that can be both a digital mapping exercise, on a grid that is agreed upon by those who are working on the project, and you start also co-design labs in the city, as we did in Bologna, where you see that's the mayor of Bologna, and this is the commissioner, the Matteo Lepore from, the commissioner who is responsible for, all the programs around the commons and collaborative economy. So, because of course you can use the digital tool, but there is a digital divide, and you need to reach out to those who are not, digital enabled. So we started this and we extracted some hypotheses, usually 3 hypotheses, 3 experimentations. Before designing any regulation, any public policies, you need to practice. You need to experiment with city inhabitants. You need to actually do the stuff. You need to see, and that's how really the regulation was born. Out of 3 experimentation, 3 experimental projects, emblematic projects in the city, in 3 different areas of the city. And these are the labs that are made with citizens, city inhabitants on specific projects. This is a project in the outskirts, in the peripheria of Bologna, in a place where there is public housing. 60% of people that are from other countries in Bologna that are legal alien, but they are still not Italians, and they are usually expelled, from the conversation. So we reached out to them, but it's also the place where all the refugees are basically hosted in a unit that is called the Via Mattei hub of migrants. So you kind of have all the different, and also, of course, you have the well-established people from Bologna, from generations. You kind of have the city as a commons in a diverse way. So we are trying now in this experimentation round. There are 3 experimentation grounds now, and this is the second experimentation round. So the first one was to generate the regulation. Now we are working these 3 new experimentation grounds to generate 2 things mainly. A new policy, commons-based policy based on for public housing, to transform public housing into commons-based public housing, and also to build the sort of administrative infrastructure that is going to manage in the future years this process. So this what we called the Office for Imagination. And these are the meetings that I held after always after all the labs that we do, to understand what guidelines we can extract from the practice on the ground with city inhabitants. And these are people that are, civil servants, but they are also activists, practitioners that work with us, and of course there is me and other scholars. And this Office for Civic Imagination is going to be a sort of bridging institution between the city as a government and the city as the city inhabitants, and is going to create and manage this process in the future year, the co-city protocol. And then you don't have, once you extract these guidelines, you start prototyping the regulation, the public policy, as we did with the regulation. The regulation for us is a prototype. After 3 years of experimentation, next year we are going to, after the evaluation process that we are running in these next months, and that we started a few months ago, 200 and more pacts of collaboration, we are now going to evaluate. We are now going back the word to those who signed pacts of collaboration to understand what went wrong, what is missing. And on the basis of the evaluation, we are going to redesign the regulation, or maybe just design a new tool for the urban commons. And that's the same thing that we are going to do with others. So to go back to just to give you the image of the process, it's a 6-step process. You talk, you map, you practice, you experiment, you prototype, you model, and you test, you evaluate. So now we are trying to basically use this protocol that we coded, and of course in other cities in Italy and in the world. We are starting in Amsterdam and New York. This might be interesting because in Reggio Emilia we are using this code to this protocol, this process to design an incubator of open commons, of digital culture, to enable social innovation. to address all those social problems that I was talking to you about. And we're going to use digital, open software and free culture to understand how we can, create an hybrid and an intersection between these two. And so we are trying to, of course, the idea is that's the Bologna Protocol. And we would like to understand how, if first, and how this protocol could work in other cities and in other territories. And that's where I leave you today, and I will talk, I will give you the last slide, which is the kind of research background and the channels of, where you can get updates. And that's, basically what I read, what I said today is basically in this tool. So I really welcome any critiques, any suggestions, and also the willingness to work together on this project, because I think that we are just at the beginning. Thank you.